Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Thursday, the 7th of November here in London. I'm Caroline Hebke.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Kamala Harris concedes defeat as the Republicans edge closer to winning the House on top of the Senate and the presidency.
Traders pile into US stocks as Wall Street bets on a pro-growth agenda from the Trump administration.
Plus, rate risks return as the Federal Reserve and Bank of England get set to cut. Bets on further easing take a hit with proposed trade tariffs in focus.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Donald Trump is on his way back to the White House after a stunning political comeback. With the completion of Trump's victory across swing states, Vice President Kamala Harris has conceded defeat. She addressed her supporters at Howard University in Washington, D.C.
Earlier today, I spoke with President-elect Trump and congratulated him on his victory. I also told him that we will help him and his team with their transition, and that we will engage in a peaceful transfer of power.
The defeat for Harris caps a whirlwind campaign for the country's first female vice president, who sought to make history by becoming the first female president. Her 107-day pitch to voters came after Biden's decision to drop out of the race and endorse her. However, the Democratic nominee was unable to escape the headwinds from the electorate's frustration with the administration over decades-high inflation and a migrant surge across the US-Mexico border.
In less than 11 weeks, President-elect Trump will once again take the oath of office on the same Capitol steps where a mob of supporters battled police in a failed attempt to override his 2020 election loss. The Republican has set his sights on tax cuts and deregulation, whilst promising sharp tariff increases and the mass deportation of illegal migrants. Here's the former RNC chair and former Trump White House chief of staff, Reince Priebus, on Trump's victory.
He created a diverse blue-collar coalition in this country made up of Hispanic voters, black voters, Asian voters. It was across the board. And it wasn't just a ground game thing. I mean, he came reasonably close in New Jersey, in Minnesota, in New Mexico. There was no ground game there. People heard what Donald Trump was preaching, and people in this country liked it.
Reince Priebus's comments come as national exit polls show Trump expanded his margin among men from 2020, whilst Kamala Harris did not do any better than Biden among women. Trump also gained ground compared to 2020 with black voters of both genders and with Latino men.
Democrats' chances of taking control of the US House of Representatives are dwindling, with Republicans gaining confidence and retaining control. All 435 House seats were up for re-election. Republicans have won 205 so far and Democrats 190. Republican gains in races in Pennsylvania, Michigan and North Carolina have offset losses in New York. Democrats' hopes for a check on Donald Trump's power by controlling the House are fading, but the battle for the House could ultimately come down to 5 hard-fought races in California, where absentee ballots can be counted for up to a week after the election, provided they're postmarked by Election Day.
In the markets, the S&P 500, Nasdaq and Dow all rose to record highs on the election news. Traders piled into US assets, predicting the president-elect will favour tax cuts and protectionist policies. Queen's College Cambridge president and Bloomberg opinion columnist Mohammed El-Arian says the market moves make sense.
This is the emergence of a new power structure in the United States. And I think the markets are reacting in an incredibly rational fashion. In fact, if you look at how the markets have treated the last few months, they've done much better than the political scientists in terms of predicting what could happen and then in reacting to what has happened.
Mohammed El-Arian there on what was the best day after a US election for the S&P 500 in history. The euro, meanwhile, saw its worst drop in 4 years, with some traders predicting that it might reach parity with the US dollar. Skeptics are concerned about the threat of a potential trade war with the US and its diverging interest rate path.
Jerome Powell is widely expected to announce a quarter-point cut in interest rates later today, but what the Federal Reserve does after that is much less certain. The election result has upended expectations around inflation, bond yields and growth. Bloomberg's international economics and policy correspondent Michael McKee explains.
Next year path is going to be interesting to see how they handle it, which we won't find out really until December. But because there's no way to put any kind of model on what the economy is going to do under a Trump plan, because Trump doesn't have a plan, he just has some talking points, the Fed is going to have to wait. And so we'll hear a lot of Jay Powell saying, we don't know.
Michael McKee adds that yields on long-dated treasuries are already up 20 basis points as Wall Street positions for fewer coming cuts. While the Fed's rate path is in doubt and tariffs are looming, central banks all around the world are signalling a willingness to protect their currencies.
Well, policymakers at the Bank of England will decide whether to lower borrowing costs for the second time this year, today. But their choice may also be overshadowed by both the government's recent budget and Donald Trump's election victory. Bloomberg's UK correspondent Lizzie Burden has more.
Economists expect the Bank of England to cut interest rates again today, but the path ahead is less certain. Events at home and overseas have thrown the road ahead into doubt, causing bets to fluctuate on financial markets. Just last week, Chancellor Rachel Reeves announced one of the biggest fiscal loosenings in decades. Her borrowing splurge is likely to force the Monetary Policy Committee to expect higher inflation in the years to come. UK policymakers will also determine the first major central bank reaction to Donald Trump's victory, a win which threatens to send shockwaves across the global economy. In London, Lizzie Burden, Bloomberg Radio.
Germany's Chancellor has called for a snap election after his three-way coalition collapsed over economic revival plans. Things came to a head after Olaf Scholz dismissed his finance minister Christian Lindner over his refusal of a proposal to suspend borrowing rules to plug a budget shortfall. Scholz told reporters he plans to table a no-confidence vote on January 15th. If his government loses, the country will face a snap election in March. The move comes amid economic stagnation, rising geopolitical tensions and a potential trade war with the United States.
And those are your top stories now on the markets. A day to really reflect upon yesterday. The S&P 500, Nasdaq, Dow all hit all-time highs. Big tech in the form of the Mag 7 also hit all-time highs. The S&P 500 having its best post-election day in history. So despite some of the preparation of investors, it was not really priced in, it turns out, the Trump win. Trading volumes also soared post-election, 63% above average. As for the European reaction, the euro had its worst day in 4 years. Bitcoin hit a record high after the election. And then just looking at the inflationary impact of the possibility of that from Trump's policies, US 30-year yields jumped the most since March 2020. 10-year yields now stand at 4.42 and those long yields at 4.6% in the US. This morning, you do have gains in Asia, in China, across the MSCI Asia Pacific Index. Stock futures also are heading higher right now, both for Europe and for the US. So those are the markets.
In a moment, we'll discuss what's next after Donald Trump's victory in the presidential election in the US yesterday. Plus, we'll look ahead to more on those central bank decisions today from the Fed and the Bank of England. But first, it wasn't just Donald Trump who was a big winner yesterday. There was also someone called Freddie 9999. And if you're not sure who he is, we aren't either, but we can tell you he's a French national with extensive experience in financial services and that he's expected to make a profit of around $48 million on bets that he made around the US.
$48 million, that is quite some swoop. Of course, this whole issue with Polymarket sort of popped up because of these outsized bets around Trump just in the run-up to the election. The issue is that you can't be a US citizen, apparently, to use this website. So that's why we know that he's French, and that's the only thing that has been revealed. So
yeah, indeed. But based on the trading patterns running up to the election, we've worked out that his bets on Trump winning the election could net him that massive $48 million as well. Interesting move, because it's one of the things that we've been tracking running up to this election as to how to track sentiment ahead of the voting day, of course. But it looks like a big payday for that particular user of the Polymarket trading platform.
Now, Trump populism is back and the world is adjusting, while Democrats' hopes of having a check on Republican power by holding on to the House are fading. Joining us now to discuss is Bloomberg senior editor Bill Ferries. Bill, good morning. Trump promised tax cuts, tariffs and mass deportations if Republicans win the House as well. How much of his agenda will be adopted by the US? What does it mean for America and the world?
Right. Well, I think you're going to see pieces of that agenda all implemented perhaps quite early in in Donald Trump's second term in the White House. Some of that does depend on how these final races wrap up in the House of Representatives. California, as I think you guys mentioned at the top, is going to be very close in some of these districts, and there are still ballots on their way in the mail to officials. So you have until a week from Election Day, so until Tuesday for those ballots to arrive if they were postmarked before Election Day. So those races may not be called for till next week. But yeah, I think, first of all, tax cuts. Donald Trump's 2017 tax cut legislation is set to expire in 2025. I think that's going to be a priority for the administration, regardless of whether they have the House, to try to get those extended through the end of his term at least. Tariffs, I don't think we're going to see the big wall of tariffs come down on day one. But I think you could see some at least symbolic tariffs coming up very early. Things like Chinese EVs, batteries, things that are already have difficult to get in the United States, particularly the EVs. He could easily increase the tariffs on those and then start using the threat of tariffs as a negotiation tactic against other countries. And then deportations, I think a lot of his advisors have said they want their focus to be initially on getting migrants who are in the country illegally and have criminal records deported first. That's something that used to have bipartisan support. Barack Obama's administration did a lot of that as well. I think that you'll see increased resources going to immigration officials to step up some deportations very quickly in a new Trump term.
Meanwhile, China's President Xi Jinping has congratulated Donald Trump and urged healthy and sustainable US-China ties. What is the thinking on the possibility for a trade war?
Well, those tariffs would certainly spark one. And there's been some analyses, including one by Macquarie Bank today, saying that if the U.S. put in all of the tariffs that Trump has proposed during his campaign, that could cut 2 points of growth off Chinese GDP. And China would certainly respond. They're certainly in a better place to respond. They have particularly rare earth metals and other critical minerals that they could halt exports of to the United States. So you very quickly could turn into having a trade war disrupting supply chains and the global economy. But Donald Trump's a guy who's always liked to make a deal. And he feels like he has good personal relationships with people like Xi Jinping. I would expect them to be, well, we think they may have already spoken, but I would expect them to be talking very early after he takes office, and with President Xi trying to talk Donald Trump down from some of those tariff promises he made in the campaign.
Meanwhile, Kamala Harris made a brief concession speech last night referencing the importance of upholding the US Constitution. Democrats now face an existential crisis, don't they? I mean, perhaps even more bitter than usual.
Yeah, when you look at how Kamala Harris underperformed even in states that she won and even among demographic groups that she won, it's a pretty stunning rebuke across the country. I mean, by and large, Republicans made gains just about everywhere. Even a state like New York that Joe Biden won with 65% of the vote 4 years ago, Kamala Harris got 60%. So 5% gain in New York. Harris still wins, but Trump showed that he has a broader base of support than I think many people would have guessed on 6 months ago. So Democrats have to do a lot of autopsies on what went wrong and how they get themselves back in the game. Midterm elections just 2 years away, less than 2 years away at this point, and that's the next focus for Dems.
Okay, Bill Ferries, our senior editor, thank you very much for joining us.
Meanwhile, markets had a frantic day of repricing around the world after Trump's victory, with stocks hitting record highs and a sell-off in bonds, given the possibility of more inflation. This as we look ahead to the rate decisions from the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England later today. Joining us now to discuss our markets reporter Valerie Teitel. Just put into context how big the moves were yesterday.
What a risk-on rally we saw across markets yesterday. Not only the S&P reaching new all-time highs, but the Dow, the NASDAQ, Mag 7 all closed at record highs last night, and they're extending in the Asia session today, with S&P futures up another 0.2%. Also, if you look under the hood, you can see more stocks on the rise that are, I guess, leveraged to domestic growth. We had regional bank stocks rallying, big investment banks and small regional banks rallying. We also saw the small caps, Russell 2000 index rallying nearly 6% into the close. And the volumes behind this were very strong, Caroline. 68% above average volumes we saw on this equity move yesterday. So it had a lot of momentum behind it.
If we look ahead to the next big market event, of course, we have the Federal Reserve later on today. We're going to be hearing from Jerome Powell. He's going to be facing a lot of tough questions about how Donald Trump's policies might impact the Federal Reserve. Is he actually likely to address any of them?
He's unlikely to, but he's going to face a rout of tough questions. His response is more likely to be framed on, I'm not going to speculate on policy. The Fed is not going to react until we actually see legislation on paper being passed. But he's going to be asked questions on tariffs. Does he think they're inflationary, or is he more worried about the downside hits to growth? And then when it comes to tax cuts, is he more worried about that boosting the fiscal deficit, or is he more worried about the boost to growth? And then, we have the question over deportation of migrants. Is he worried that that's going to tighten the labor market? And lastly, his energy policy, drill, baby, drill, as he said. He wants to get oil down to $40 a barrel. Is that going to boost growth, or is it going to be a deflationary impulse? He's going to get asked all these questions. He's probably going to push back on giving any concrete answer. But of course, the market is going to be very attuned to every single word he says when he does answer these questions for any hints on any upcoming policy changes.
And yet there will also be underlying issues and surely some questions about the independence of the Federal Reserve itself and the pressure that Powell will face. I mean, Bloomberg's John Micklethwaite, when he had that major sit-down with Trump and that long interview in the run-up to the election, asked about this. Trump was quite equivocal on this point.
Yeah, he did slightly hint that he wanted to be more involved in Federal Reserve rate decisions. But Caroline, you have to, I guess, acknowledge that the Federal Reserve is easing at the moment. And normally politicians want a dovish central bank when they're in power. It helps them boost growth, etc. So we probably, I don't see him pushing too much back on Powell in terms of the path ahead, because we have priced in so many more cuts, and the Fed has told us that they plan on easing. But we don't know. That's a big question mark. And also, Powell's term is up May 2026. So we're going to have a lot of discussion next year on the possible successor to Powell. And perhaps that could be a more political name that goes in to run the Federal Reserve, and his influence would be on that Federal Reserve chair pick.
So that's an interesting issue to keep an eye on as we look down the line. Valerie, just a word too on the other central bank decision that we're watching closely today, among the several that are happening, I should point out. The Bank of England, we saw the pound slump, gilt yields jumped yesterday. What should we be thinking about in terms of the Bank of England? This
is another central bank dealing with a reaction to the change of government. We heard from the Office for Budget Responsibility, their response to the budget is that it is going to boost inflation and hence going to boost the bank rate of the Bank of England. We get their forecast from the Bank of England today, so it'll be interesting to see how they have interpreted the budget and how that compares to the OBR's forecast. Those forecasts drop at the same time of their rate decision. I expect most of the market reaction to be on those forecasts.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.